Stop. If you sign that, you're handing them your entire company. The words didn't echo loudly, but they landed heavy enough to bend the air. The room went still in a way that didn't feel natural, like something invisible had just pressed pause on a billion-dollar decision. 42 floors above the city, inside a glass-walled boardroom washed in pale morning light, every movement slowed. Pens hovered. A tablet screen dimmed. A man in a tailored navy suit blinked once, twice, as if trying to process what he had just heard. Then, slowly, heads began to turn. Not toward the head of the table, not toward the legal team, but toward the far side of the room, toward a woman who wasn't supposed to exist in that moment. Emily Carter stood near the marble credenza, a silver tray balanced carefully in her hands, 3 untouched glasses of water trembling just slightly from the shift in her grip. Her uniform was simple, pressed but worn at the seams, the small stitched badge on her chest reading, "Service Staff." It was the kind of label that usually made people invisible. But right now, nothing about her was invisible. The CEO, Richard Hale, didn't move at first. He sat at the center of the long obsidian table, posture perfect, fingers resting lightly on the edge of a document that could reshape entire markets. His presence filled the room the way silence fills a cathedral, quiet, but absolute. When he finally lifted his eyes, they didn't carry anger yet. Just calculation. A quiet, precise kind of curiosity. Around him, the executives shifted in their chairs. Someone let out a soft, disbelieving exhale. Another leaned back, lips tightening into something close to a smirk. The kind of expression reserved for moments that felt absurd. "Did she just?" one of them murmured, not finishing the sentence. The air conditioning hummed faintly overhead, the only sound daring to continue. Emily didn't step back. She didn't lower her gaze. Her hands steadied, fingers tightening just enough to stop the faint rattle of glass. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, not defiance, not fear, but recognition. Like she had seen this moment before, just in a different room, under different lights. She took one careful step forward, the soft click of her shoes against polished stone cutting through the silence with surgical precision. The tray lowered slowly onto the table's edge. "Page 42, she said, her voice even now, quieter than before but somehow more certain. "There's a clause buried under the compliance section. It shifts all post-merger liability to your side." A few heads turned back toward the documents, but not all. Some stayed fixed on her, watching, measuring, waiting for the moment she would falter. Waiting for her place to be restored. Near the door, a security guard straightened, one hand brushing the radio at his shoulder, awaiting the slightest signal. But Richard Hale didn't give it. Not yet. His fingers moved, almost absent-mindedly, sliding the top page aside. The faint sound of paper against polished wood seemed louder than it should have been. His gaze dropped. Lines of text. Dense, technical, carefully constructed to be overlooked. His jaw shifted. Just slightly. The room leaned into that movement without realizing it, drawn by something no one could name yet. And for the first time since the meeting began, the man who controlled everything in that room stopped controlling the moment. Richard Hale did not look up immediately, and that hesitation carried more weight than any reaction he could have given. His eyes moved line by line, slower now, more deliberate, as if each word had suddenly gained gravity. The room watched him, not her anymore, because in a space like this, truth did not exist until he acknowledged it. Emily remained still beside the table, her posture upright, hands now empty, resting lightly at her sides. Without the tray, she looked smaller, more exposed, but somehow more grounded, like she had stepped into the moment fully and could not step back even if she wanted to. A man 2 seats down cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the quiet. "Sir, we have already reviewed that section," he said carefully, his voice carrying the polished confidence of someone used to being right. "It is standard language." The word standard lingered in the air, thin and fragile. Richard's finger stopped. Mid-page. Not at the beginning of the clause, but deep within it, where the sentences grew longer, more complex, layered in legal phrasing designed to blur intent. His brow tightened, just slightly, and that small shift sent a ripple through the room. Someone shifted in their chair. Another leaned forward, trying to read his expression. The confidence that had filled the room minutes ago began to thin, replaced by something less certain. Emily noticed it, not by looking at them, but by feeling the change in the air. It was the same feeling she had known before, in quieter places, when people realized too late that they had overlooked something important. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself, the faint scent of polished wood and cold air filling her lungs. "It is not standard," she said, her voice calm, not louder, but clearer now. "The liability is reversed after the closing trigger. It transfers all post-event exposure to your side, even in cases of pre-existing risk." The words landed clean, precise, not rushed. For a moment, no one challenged her. Then a soft, almost dismissive chuckle came from the far end of the table. "And how exactly would you know that?" the same executive asked, leaning back with a measured smile that did not reach his eyes. "You serve water in this room." The sentence was not raised, not harsh, but it carried the quiet weight of dismissal, the kind that was meant to restore order without appearing aggressive. A few heads nodded faintly, grateful for the return to something familiar. Emily did not react to the tone. She had heard versions of it before, in classrooms she could not afford to stay in offices where her name had been overlooked, in spaces where her presence was tolerated but never valued. Her gaze remained steady, not on the man who spoke, but on the document still open in front of Richard Hale. "Because it is written to be missed," she said. "That is the point." The room tightened again, but differently this time. Less dismissive, more cautious. Richard's hand moved, turning the page slightly, then back again, rereading the same lines. The faint reflection of the overhead lights flickered across the polished surface of the table, catching the edge of the paper, the curve of his watch, the tension building in his stillness. Near the door, the security guard lowered his hand from the radio without realizing it. No one had given the signal. No one was asking for her to be removed anymore. The shift was subtle, almost invisible, but it was there. Control had not left the room, but it was no longer absolute. And at the center of it, a woman who had been invisible just minutes ago now stood as the only person who seemed completely certain of what was about to happen. Richard Hale did not speak right away, and that silence began to stretch in a way that made everyone else uncomfortable. His eyes moved again across the same paragraph, slower this time, as if the words had rearranged themselves into something sharper, something harder to ignore. The executive who had spoken earlier shifted in his seat, the confidence in his posture starting to fade as he leaned forward slightly, trying to follow the exact line where Richard's finger had stopped. A faint crease formed between Richard's brows, not dramatic, not obvious, but enough to signal that something had changed beneath the surface. The room felt tighter now, the air heavier, as if the glass walls had moved a few inches closer without anyone noticing. Emily remained exactly where she was, her shoulders relaxed but her stance grounded, as if she had already accepted whatever outcome would come next. She did not try to explain further, did not repeat herself, because the moment had already shifted out of her hands and into his. One of the legal advisors quietly opened his tablet, scrolling quickly, his fingers moving faster than before, searching for confirmation or contradiction, anything that would restore the balance they had just lost. Another man leaned in, whispering something under his breath, but it did not carry far enough to break the tension that now held the entire room in place. Richard's thumb pressed lightly against the edge of the page, holding it there as his gaze locked onto a single sentence buried deep within the clause. His jaw tightened again, this time just enough for those closest to him to notice. Then he exhaled, slow and controlled, but not relaxed. "Read this," he said finally, his voice low, directed toward the legal advisor to his right without looking up. The advisor leaned closer, eyes scanning the line, and for a brief second, his expression remained unchanged. Then it shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. His lips parted slightly, and the faintest trace of uncertainty crept into his posture. "It appears," he began, then stopped, recalibrating his words. It appears the exposure extends beyond the standard scope. The phrasing was careful, measured, but it was not a denial. Around the table, the subtle confidence that had defined the room began to dissolve completely. Someone sat back in their chair, the leather creaking softly, while another lowered their gaze to the document, suddenly unwilling to meet anyone else's eyes. The man who had dismissed Emily earlier did not speak again. He simply stared at the page in front of him, his expression tightening as the implications began to settle in. Emily felt the shift fully now, not in words, but in the absence of them. No one questioned her anymore. No one laughed. The quiet that filled the room was no longer dismissive. It was reflective, heavy with realization. Richard finally lifted his head, his gaze moving across the table, not hurried, not uncertain, but different. Calculated in a new way. He was not looking for confirmation anymore. He was measuring consequences. Then, slowly, his eyes moved to Emily. For the first time since she had spoken, he looked at her without the filter of status, without the assumption of her role. Just a direct, steady look that acknowledged something had changed. "Explain it," he said. Not loudly. Not harshly. But clearly enough that there was no confusion about who he was addressing. The words landed in the center of the room, and for a moment, no one else moved. Because in that single sentence, the hierarchy of the room had shifted. And everyone knew it. Emily did not answer immediately, and that pause carried its own weight, not hesitation, but precision, as if she understood that every word from this point forward would be measured differently. Her eyes moved briefly to the document, then back to Richard Hale, steady and clear, no longer standing at the edge of the room but at the center of its attention. She stepped closer to the table, not rushed, not uncertain, and the soft sound of her shoes against the polished floor seemed louder now that no one else dared to interrupt. Her hand hovered just above the paper for a second before pointing to a specific line, not the headline, not the obvious section, but the part designed to be overlooked. "The language here looks protective," she said, her voice calm, even, carrying just enough to reach every corner of the room without force. "It references compliance adjustments and regulatory flexibility, which makes it sound standard, but it is not." A few heads leaned in closer, eyes narrowing as they followed where she pointed. The legal advisor beside Richard adjusted his glasses, reading again, slower this time. Emily continued, her tone unchanged, but the clarity in her words cutting through the layered complexity of the text. "The trigger is tied to post-merger events, but the responsibility is defined retroactively. That means if anything surfaces after the deal closes, even if it existed before, your company absorbs the full liability." The words settled into the room like a slow realization, not dramatic, but undeniable. Someone shifted in their chair. Another tapped a pen once against the table, then stopped, as if even small sounds felt inappropriate now. Richard's gaze remained fixed on the document, but his posture had changed. The ease was gone, replaced by a stillness that suggested calculation at a deeper level. Emily moved her finger slightly down the page. "And here," she added, quieter now, but no less certain. "They included a secondary clause that limits your ability to contest it. It frames any dispute as a breach of agreement." The legal advisor inhaled slowly, his shoulders tightening as the implication became clear. "That would make reversal nearly impossible," he said, more to himself than to the room. No one contradicted him. The executive who had dismissed her earlier looked down, his expression no longer confident, his earlier certainty dissolving into silence. The room, once filled with controlled authority, now felt like it was listening instead of deciding. Emily straightened slightly, her hand lowering back to her side. She did not add anything unnecessary, did not over-explain, because the truth did not need decoration. It was already there, written in precise legal language that had almost gone unnoticed. Richard finally leaned back just a fraction, his fingers still resting on the edge of the document, but no longer relaxed. His eyes lifted again, meeting Emily's directly. There was no dismissal in that look now, no assumption, only recognition that something critical had shifted. The balance of the room had moved, not loudly, not visibly, but completely. And for a brief moment, no one spoke, because the weight of what had just been revealed was still settling, and no one wanted to be the first to break it. No one spoke for a few seconds after Emily finished, and the silence no longer felt accidental. It felt earned. The kind of silence that follows something undeniable. Richard Hale remained still, his fingers resting lightly on the document, but the tension in his hand had changed. It was no longer casual. It was controlled, deliberate, as if every movement now required thought. Around the table, the shift became visible in small ways. A senior advisor who had been leaning back now sat upright, elbows on the table, eyes scanning the clause again with a level of attention that had not been there before. Another executive adjusted his tie, not out of habit, but discomfort, the kind that comes when certainty begins to slip. The legal advisor cleared his throat quietly, his voice more careful than before. "If this interpretation holds," he said slowly, choosing each word with precision, "the exposure could extend into prior liabilities that were never disclosed." He did not finish the sentence, but he did not need to. The implication settled across the room like a weight. Richard's gaze did not leave the document. "Could," he repeated, almost to himself, but the tone suggested he already knew the answer. The advisor hesitated, then nodded once. "Yes, sir." The word "sir" sounded different now, less assured. A faint sound came from the far end of the table, a pen placed down a little too firmly, followed by a quiet exhale. The executive who had questioned Emily earlier leaned forward again, this time without the edge in his expression. "We should verify the intent with their counsel," he said, his voice measured, attempting to regain control of the direction. But even as he spoke, it was clear the momentum had shifted beyond simple verification. Emily stood quietly, her presence no longer questioned, yet not fully understood. She did not step forward again. She did not repeat herself. She simply remained where she was, grounded in the certainty she had already placed in the room. Richard finally lifted the page fully, turning it back and forth once, as if testing the weight of what he was holding. The faint reflection of the city skyline moved across the glass behind him, sunlight cutting through the room at a sharper angle now, catching the edges of the table, the documents, the still faces of the people seated around him. He leaned back slightly, just enough to break the forward tension, but not enough to relax. His eyes moved across the room, one by one, measuring reactions, recalibrating positions. No one met his gaze with the same confidence they had earlier. No one offered a quick solution. And that absence said more than any argument could. The deal, which had felt inevitable just minutes ago, now hung in a fragile balance. Richard's hand moved again, closing the document slowly, not with force, but with finality. The soft sound of paper against paper carried through the silence. He placed it on the table, flat, centered, as if resetting the entire conversation. Then, without raising his voice, he spoke. "We are not signing this today." The words landed with quiet authority, but this time, they did not come from certainty alone. They came from recognition. A few shoulders eased, but not in relief, more in acknowledgement of how close they had come to something irreversible. The executive who had dismissed Emily looked down, his expression tightening, but he said nothing. There was nothing left to say that would restore what had just shifted. Richard's gaze moved back to Emily, holding there for a moment longer than necessary. Not questioning. Not dismissing. Simply seeing. And in that moment, the room understood something that had not been written in any contract. The power had not disappeared. It had been redirected. And it had started with a voice no one had expected to hear. The room did not return to normal after that decision, and that was the part no one acknowledged out loud. Papers were still on the table, screens still glowing, but the energy had shifted into something quieter, more fragile. People began gathering their things, not hurried, not chaotic, but with a kind of careful distance, as if they were stepping away from something they had almost touched and did not fully understand. Chairs slid back softly. A tablet screen dimmed. The low hum of the air conditioning returned, filling the space that had been held by tension just moments before. Emily did not move right away. She stood beside the table, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, but inside, something had loosened. Not relief exactly, but a release of the pressure that had been building since the moment she spoke. She glanced once at the document, now closed, resting flat under Richard Hale's hand, then shifted her gaze toward the window. The city stretched out beyond the glass, distant and indifferent, sunlight reflecting off buildings in quiet patterns that did not care what had just happened inside this room. For a brief second, it grounded her. Reminded her how small this moment was in the larger world, and yet how close it had come to changing everything for the people sitting here. A few executives walked past her without speaking, their expressions unreadable, their focus turned inward. One of them slowed slightly, as if considering saying something, then continued on without a word. The absence of dismissal was noticeable. No one asked her to leave. No one corrected her presence. It was not acknowledgement yet, but it was no longer rejection. Near the far end of the table, the legal advisor gathered his notes, stacking them neatly, his movements slower than before. He glanced once toward Emily, not long, just enough to register her in a different way, then lowered his gaze again. Richard remained seated longer than the others. His hand rested on the closed document, fingers still, as if he was measuring the weight of what had just been avoided. The lines of control that had defined him earlier had not disappeared, but they had softened into something more reflective. He was not rushing to the next decision. He was sitting in the one he had just made. Emily finally reached for the silver tray, lifting it with both hands. The familiar weight settled into her palms, grounding her again in the role she had walked in with. The contrast did not escape her. Just minutes ago, she had been invisible. Now, the room had changed because she chose not to be. She turned toward the door, her steps quiet, measured, the same as when she entered, but the space she moved through was not the same. The glass door stood slightly open, a narrow gap leading back to the hallway beyond. She paused for just a fraction of a second, not out of hesitation, but awareness. Then she stepped through. The hallway outside felt cooler, quieter, the sounds more ordinary. Distant footsteps. A soft chime from an elevator. The kind of normal that continued regardless of what happened behind closed doors. Emily walked forward without looking back, her reflection briefly catching in the polished wall, then fading as she moved past it. Inside the boardroom, the silence lingered even after she was gone, but it was no longer the silence of tension. It was the silence of something understood too late, and just in time. The hallway swallowed the sound of Emily's footsteps almost immediately, but inside the boardroom, the silence remained, heavier now without her presence to anchor it. Richard Hale did not follow right away. He sat there, eyes fixed not on the closed document, but on the space where she had stood, as if something in that exact spot had shifted in a way he could not ignore. Around him, the room had mostly emptied, leaving behind only a few lingering figures, quiet conversations murmuring at the edges, careful, controlled, but no longer confident. The legal advisor stood near the window, reviewing notes again, slower. Now more cautious, as though every line on every page carried a question he had not thought to ask before. Richard finally moved. Not abruptly, not with urgency, but with intention. His chair slid back with a soft sound against the polished floor, and he stood, straightening his jacket out of habit more than necessity. His gaze passed once more over the table, the untouched glasses of water, the scattered documents, the chair where she had been visible for the first time. Then he turned and walked toward the door. The hallway outside was brighter, quieter, filled with the ordinary rhythm of a building that did not know what had just been avoided upstairs. People moved past him without stopping, assistants carrying folders, employees checking their phones, the distant chime of an elevator opening and closing. It all felt smaller somehow. Richard paused just beyond the doorway, scanning the corridor, his eyes searching with a focus that was different from before. Not control. Not command. Something closer to recognition. At the far end, near the service elevator, he saw her. Emily stood beside a stainless steel cart, placing the glasses back into their slots with careful precision, her movements steady, almost ritual, as if restoring order in a world that expected her to remain unseen. For a moment, he did not approach. He simply watched. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Minutes ago, she had stood in a room full of power and shifted its direction with a single sentence. Now, she was back in a space where no one would expect her to speak at all. Emily finished arranging the tray and reached for a folded cloth, wiping a small drop of water from the edge of the metal surface. Her focus was quiet, internal, as if she had already stepped away from what had happened. When she finally looked up, their eyes met across the distance. It was brief, but it held something unspoken. Richard walked toward her then, his steps measured, each one closing the space between two worlds that rarely intersected. A few employees glanced in his direction, surprised, but said nothing. When he reached her, he stopped just short of the cart, leaving a respectful distance, not the distance of hierarchy, but of acknowledgement. For a second, neither of them spoke. The building hummed softly around them, the sound of distant voices and moving machinery filling the gaps between their silence. Richard was the first to break it, his voice lower than it had been in the boardroom, stripped of performance. "You saw it immediately," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. Emily held his gaze, her expression calm, grounded. "I recognized the pattern," she replied simply. No explanation. No attempt to elevate herself. Just the truth, delivered the same way she had in the room above. Richard nodded once, slowly, as if that answer carried more meaning than a longer explanation ever could. He looked at her differently now, not searching for credentials, not measuring her role, but understanding that what mattered had already been proven. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something new, something neither of them needed to define. And for the first time that day, the distance between who she was and where she stood no longer seemed fixed. Richard did not look away after her answer, and that was what made the moment different. In every room he had ever controlled, conversations moved fast, decisions faster, and people adjusted to him without hesitation. But here, standing beside a service cart in a quiet hallway, he did not rush to fill the space. He let the silence exist, let it settle, as if he understood that interrupting it would diminish something important. Emily adjusted one of the glasses slightly, aligning it with the others, her movements precise but unhurried, as though she was finishing something that needed to be done before anything else could begin. She did not step back, did not lower her eyes, but she also did not lean into the moment. She simply stood in it, steady, unchanged. Richard glanced briefly at the cart, then back at her, the smallest shift in his expression suggesting something closer to reflection than authority. "You could have stayed quiet," he said, his voice measured, not accusatory, not testing, just stating a reality that both of them understood. Emily's fingers rested lightly on the edge of the metal surface, the cool texture grounding beneath her touch. She took a slow breath, then answered without hesitation. "Yes." The word was simple, but it held weight. Richard waited, sensing there was more, but not pushing for it. After a moment, she continued, her voice calm, steady, the same tone she had carried into the boardroom. "But then you would have signed it." No emphasis. No judgment. Just the truth laid out as clearly as the clause she had pointed to. The hallway seemed quieter for a second, as if even the distant sounds had softened around that sentence. Richard exhaled slowly, the breath controlled, but not entirely neutral. He nodded once, acknowledging the logic without resistance. "Most people would not have taken that risk," he said. Emily met his gaze evenly. "Most people do not think it is their place." The words did not challenge him, but they did not soften themselves either. They existed exactly as they were meant to. Richard looked at her for a moment longer, then something in his posture shifted, not dramatically, but enough to mark a change. The distance between them was still there, but it no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like a space being reconsidered. "Where did you learn to read contracts like that?" he asked, his tone quieter now, stripped of the weight it would have carried in the boardroom. Emily's gaze moved briefly down the hallway, not searching for anything, just grounding herself before answering. "I studied finance," she said. A while ago. She did not expand. Did not explain why it had stopped. The pause after her words filled in the rest without needing detail. Richard understood enough. His eyes shifted slightly, not away from her, but through the implication, the unspoken distance between where she had been and where she stood now. For a moment, neither of them spoke again. The building continued around them, indifferent and steady. Then Richard reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, pulling out a simple business card, clean, unremarkable in design, but carrying weight in what it represented. He held it for a second, then extended it toward her, not abruptly, not as an order, but as an offer. Emily looked at the card, then at him, her expression unchanged, but her attention fully present. She did not take it immediately. The moment stretched, quiet, deliberate, as if both of them understood that accepting it would mean stepping into something different, something that could not be undone. Richard did not withdraw his hand. He simply waited, his posture steady, his gaze level, giving her the space to decide. And in that stillness, the choice was no longer about a contract or a meeting. It was about whether the line that had just shifted would remain where it was, or move again. Emily looked at the card for a long second, not with hesitation, but with clarity, as if she understood exactly what it represented and what it did not. Her fingers lifted slowly from the edge of the cart, the cool metal leaving her touch as she reached forward, but just before taking it, she paused. Not to refuse. Not to accept blindly. Just to acknowledge the weight of the moment. Then she took it gently, her grip steady, her expression unchanged. The card felt light in her hand, almost too light for something that carried that much possibility. She glanced at it briefly, then lowered it to her side, not examining the name, not reacting to the title, because she already knew who he was. Richard watched her, not expecting gratitude, not waiting for a reaction, simply observing. The exchange was quiet, almost understated, but it carried more meaning than anything that had been said in the boardroom above. Emily looked back up at him, her gaze level, grounded. "Thank you," she said, her voice calm, respectful, but not diminished. It was not the kind of thank you that asked for approval. It was the kind that acknowledged an offer without surrendering her position. Richard gave a slight nod, not as a dismissal, but as recognition. For a moment, neither of them moved. The hallway continued around them, the distant rhythm of the building unchanged, as if nothing had shifted, even though everything had. Then Emily stepped back half a pace, her hand returning to the cart, fingers resting lightly on the handle. The movement was small, but it carried intention. She was not stepping away from the moment. She was placing it where it belonged, not letting it define her entirely. Richard understood. He did not reach for another word, did not extend the conversation further than it needed to go. He simply stepped aside, creating space for her path forward. Emily nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement, then turned, her steps steady as she guided the cart down the hallway. The wheels moved smoothly across the polished floor, the soft sound blending into the background of the building. She did not look back. Not because she was dismissing what had happened, but because she had already carried it forward in a different way. Richard remained where he was for a moment longer, watching her disappear into the flow of the corridor, her figure gradually blending back into the rhythm of a place that still saw her as part of its background. But he knew better now. He glanced once at the closed door of the boardroom behind him, then back toward the hallway where she had gone. The distance between those two spaces felt different now, no longer fixed, no longer unquestioned. He adjusted his jacket slightly, a familiar motion, but it no longer carried the same certainty. Then he turned and walked back toward the room, his steps measured, thoughtful. Inside, the table remained as it had been left, documents untouched, glasses of water still full. But the silence inside it had changed. It was no longer the silence of authority waiting to speak. It was the silence of something learned, something recognized without announcement. And somewhere down the hall, beyond the glass and steel and quiet decisions, a woman pushed a cart forward under the same light, her reflection passing briefly along the polished wall before fading, leaving behind nothing but the quiet certainty that she had been seen.